when we're so ingrained in, I'll just use America, when we're so ingrained in American culture and American mindset, it
Yeah.
makes it really, really difficult to get a better understanding, have grace for, and engage other cultures. When you're in the marketplace, you're able to kind of cast off those expectations, because I think as believers, a lot of times we're so rooted in American Christian culture, which is not always biblical culture. It's not always the heart of what God's called us to. Oftentimes I find when we're outside of the four walls, it makes it a little bit easier to come in with less expectation, but rather desire for relationship and introducing people to Jesus.
Welcome to this episode of the Edge of the Map podcast. We are talking in this episode about the future of missions, and particularly funding the future of missions. And really happy to have a friend on today, Mr. Philip Petrie. Is a business leader in Lexington. He is the CEO of Craftsman Contractors, a successful construction company, and just a good guy, a great leader. I've seen firsthand his business, and just was excited to share in that season. But I have him on the podcast today to really get at this issue of kingdom investment. Right, a lot of writing and talking has been done about investing in the kingdom. And I thought it would be just an awesome episode to have a business leader on with us today, who has this mentality, and he's grown in this mentality, and he's pursued this value of giving to missions through his business. And so welcome, Philip. So glad that you're here with us. Appreciate you taking the time. Well, listen, I think probably a good place to start would just to dive right in and say, as you look at your own calling as a business person and calling as a Christian, how have those two things interacted in your life to this point? What the journey that you've been on, when are those two identities, a business leader and a believer, and that impact on missions?
It's a great question. I think my answer to that would be it's been a work in progress. I've been entrepreneurial since I was a teenager, so I've always run businesses, and I think I'm at a deeper place of understanding that now than I was 20 years ago, obviously. But to be frank, I see the marketplace as the old term marketplace ministry. That's become deeply personal to me. And it hasn't always been the case, but what I've found is the impact, the opportunity for kingdom-related impact on the people that God's called us to, that are the people that work in our businesses, is really significant. And so when I go to work, hopefully every day, the goal is to engage in the things that God's called me to in relation to the people that He's called me to. And so I really don't see a difference between traditional ministry, marketplace activity, or missions. They're just the place that God's called us to care for people well and be a reflection of Him.
Yeah, that's good. I think about the times you've talked to me about just some of your own relationships in Lexington with business leaders. And that sort of is sort of a synergy that happens around just pursuing God and pursuing His work in the world. I wonder if you could say something about that, just the importance of those relationships in your life.
Yeah, I mean, there's been such an amazing joining of marketplace leaders in Lexington. When I first moved here, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago, I was impressed by it as soon as I think it was first meeting at the lunch in Lexington that I realized, my goodness, there's a sense of a tangible sense of revival happening in Lexington in the marketplace specifically. And so I think when marketplace leaders are connected relationally, but also joined spiritually, it's like fuel on the fire. We're able to give each other a vision and to some degree hold each other accountable, but also we're raising our standards, not just as far as performance and EBITDA and bottom line impact, but but ultimately relational and kingdom impact. And so just being around people that you and I both know in Lexington that are, that would be far better guests for you for today. It's deeply encouraging, and it calls us, I think it from a relational perspective, it calls us up, instead of just status quo, focusing on the P&L or trying to get through the week. It gives us a more of an eternal perspective when it comes to the marketplace.
If you could think of a time, in your season there in Lexington, running Craftsman, where it really became personal to you, and you knew, it was sort of like one of those moments where like you knew something had to change, or you knew something, a specific, just a nudge. Maybe it was a push, maybe it wasn't a nudge, but I don't know. Maybe you think about a situation like that and share with us.
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind would have been our other markets outside of Lexington. I was really focused on growth mode, and top line revenue. If you're decent at sales, isn't that hard to accomplish? But effective management that also stewards a healthy culture is much harder to do. And so we got to a point where we were, from a top line revenue perspective, probably the best we've ever been. But turns out from a cultural perspective and a bottom line perspective, it was the worst ever. And so I had to make that choice to significantly downsize, and let go of a lot of people. We shut down Atlanta, we shut down Charlotte. Actually, kind of going back to your previous question, that all happened because of relationships with other leaders here in Lexington that were aware of my situation. They knew a lot about the business, and they were able to step in and give me really wise counsel. But that choice to substantially decrease the size of the business and take a season to focus on building healthy, kingdom-oriented culture was probably the biggest move we've ever made, and also the most fruitful.
Wow. I think when it comes to culture, that's one of the things that stood out to me most when I was working more closely with you, was the kingdom culture. And that was established. So the values that were sort of growing in the organization, in the business. And, but I wonder like how you translate that to missions, right? Because I know that, some of your background involves international work, and you grew up overseas. How does missions in particular flow out of that kingdom culture that you are pursuing? And even with the business leaders that like, where's that link to missions, and particularly global missions?
Well, I think that comes down in, I can answer this question from my perspective today, but that's a journey that I'm on. That's exactly what I'm trying to continually discover. But for me, at least, it's been a journey of I would say, a more accurate understanding of calling, that calling isn't just one thing necessarily. So the calling isn't running a business. The calling isn't primarily stewarding profitability. The calling isn't primarily sales. The calling are the people to whom God's called us. And so for me, that relational orientation related to business applies the same way in when it comes to missions. So we rarely go out and desperately try and find someone to give to, right? The Lord's already provided the relationships in that sense of calling through the relationships. So I look at our involvement related to, in this season of life with 4 little kids, most of our involvement in missions is through giving, rather than going. But that's very much needed. And it's an important role that, I'm so grateful to be able to, in my own little way, fill or help with. Does that answer your question?
It does. What really stands out to me is the relationship side of things. Like for you to say things like, I don't go hunting around searching for what, but you see, you maybe if I'm putting words in your mouth, you're discerning who God has already put in your path. Would that be right?
Yeah. Discerning or discovering. It's the anticipation on a regular basis. Whenever we meet someone, it's all right, Lord, what are you doing?
Yeah. My prayer is that other business leaders, we have some business leaders that listen to us and that are involved with us. And my prayer is that they'll learn. And the calling is to ask that question, right? What are you doing, God? What do you want me to be looking at? And And I wonder if that is also just part of being a kingdom-minded person, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's the Lord's constantly transforming our minds in the way that we're thinking through the activities that he allows us to do, right? And the people that he connects us with. And
Right.
so I don't know that there's a black and white answer other than pursuing him first and allowing him to clarify what his purpose and calling really is for our involvement in the marketplace or in missions or in the church.
Yeah. I want to dive into a little bit about, we may have already discussed a little bit, kingdom return on investment. I don't know if you know, ROI is a frequent term in business. So how do we look at ROI through the lens of the kingdom and the Lord moving? And particularly, let's say, supporting missions and looking at that return on investment. How do you as a business leader translate that back and forth, right? What kinds of things do you look for return? Maybe give us a little bit of insight into how you think about that.
Well, this probably won't be very popular. I try really hard not to do that. I think, when the Lord's called us to give, we're to give without expecting in return. And so I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth, because on one hand, yes, I'm passionate
Right.
about sustainable missions, right? So we could talk for a long time about different models that I've seen that allow for missionaries to go out, and I believe to be even more impactful through their engagement in the community which God's called them. And so I love things like that I think have a higher degree of sustainability, as opposed to a missionary that goes on the mission field for 9 months and then comes back for furlough for 3 and fundraises and spends half the money traveling around the States trying to raise money. I don't love that approach. So I'm a little bit jaded in some ways. But on the other hand, when the Lord makes it clear that we're to give, I don't look for an ROI. What I'm hoping for is just to be able to be involved in the things that God's calling the other person to, and support that.
And leaving the results.
I don't have a good calculation.
Yeah, what you're saying is there's no formula there.
There's no formula, but also what I find is typically people aren't going to stay motivated and excited to do an activity that they're not finding fulfilling, right? So somebody, when they're going out in the mission field, whether it's an individual or an organization, they're anticipating and working towards fruitfulness. They'll get discouraged fast and discover they need to move on to something else. If you've given to somebody like that, there's no problem with that. You're just serving them to get to their place of calling in the meantime. So I'm not suggesting being casual about giving or not anticipating a return. Absolutely. I would love to be involved in the most impactful things that I can be involved with, but I can't control the outcome. Yeah. And so I think the key from my perspective is that it's obedience related to giving rather than accountability, right? So I'm responsible for my business. Absolutely. I'm not responsible for other people's activities. I'm responsible to steward and be led by the Holy Spirit the resources that he's allowed me to steward. But beyond that, I don't actually have responsibility. And so it's very hard to maintain and develop healthy relationships if there's an attempt towards control on behalf of the giver, or an attempt towards setting expectations that may not have been defined by that person by the Lord.
That's well said. One of the things I want to ask you, and I hope this isn't controversial, but it does get at this issue of misunderstanding. And so I'm asking you to kind of put on the general business leader hat and business, mission hat. What do you think Christian business leaders and entrepreneurs most misunderstand about giving to missions? Why don't you speak to that a little bit? What do you think, as you've maybe it's something that you've worked through personally, or maybe just sort of a general idea. What do you think they most misunderstand about giving?
From my perspective, it's not so much of a misunderstanding about missions or the importance of missions. There might be a lack of intensity or focus on it, but there's, generally speaking, I think there's a real understanding in the marketplace amongst believers about the importance of missions. I think the challenge that we all have is more related to ownership. All right. So recognizing that the resources that God has given us to steward are not our resources,
Yeah.
and not holding on to them. And so there's a difference between stewardship and it's almost like we step into micromanagement when it comes to resources. But as leaders, we've learned we're not going to micromanage our people, or they're never going to develop as a team. And so we've learned better practices when it comes to the teams of employees that we lead than we do the way we consider our own resources, or the resources that the Lord's given us to steward. And so I think that's the crux of it, is really being willing to let go instead of desperately fighting for the next dollar, and then carefully stewarding, right? Some people it's 10% tithe. Other people have different ideas about what giving looks like. But ultimately, if we're approaching the resources that God's given us with an open hand, knowing they're not our resources, they're His. They can be gone in a millisecond. If He chooses to continue blessing the activity that He's called me to, then my response in return needs to be open-handed and ready, willing, and able. So managing our own cash flow so that we're capable of being obedient when it comes to giving. And not that I'm great at that. That's a journey that I'm on.
It's a journey, sure. I remember talking to you one time, and what really stood out was the role of prayer in how you approach giving. And so I don't know, encourage maybe a young leader listening, a young entrepreneur listening, what that looks like maybe in your life, how you've discovered the importance of prayer in prioritizing certain things that come your way.
I don't spend a massive amount of time interceding when it comes to giving. For me, it's just releasing it to the Lord and asking for guidance, clarity, and peace. My secret sauce that I've discovered for this is really processing with my wife. And so the amount of times we'll sit with people that that have a vision or want to accomplish something or do something on the mission field, and we both independently of one another write a number down. And if we write the same number, which I would say 80% of the time, it's literally the same number to the dollar or to the penny. We just give. We don't ask any more questions. And so for me, it's a combination of looking for leadership from the Lord and receiving peace about the decision that I feel inclined to make, and then working with my wife to get on the same page so that we're, as a couple, investing in the things that the Lord's called us to.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Kind of a follow-up to that. What advice would you give to a young entrepreneur who wants to give faithfully, who may be listening in, or maybe God's doing something to stir in their heart? What advice would you give to a young business leader about giving to missions?
Don't wait. That'd be my biggest one. I think we especially if you're an entrepreneur early in business, cash is difficult during those seasons, and so it's very tempting to project generosity into the future instead of engaging today. Right. So the Lord calls us to steward what He's given us, and if that's a smaller amount than you anticipate, begin that journey. Then you're almost building the muscle of giving into your own practices. And so starting with intentionally choosing generosity from the very beginning, I think is really important, because if you can faithfully give when things are tight, it makes it a lot easier when there are more resources. And if you can't faithfully give when things are tight, when you have more resources, there are always going to be more reasons, right? More marketing dollars that need to be spent, more expansion, more more head count.
Yeah,
I would say good. Give early and often.
Yeah, that's great. What came to my mind as you were talking was learning that the sacrificial piece of giving, like that's the muscle, right? It's the sacrifice muscle. It's like, this is painful. This doesn't make sense from a a spreadsheet kind of sense, but it's a value and a conviction. So that's really neat. Well, man, let me ask you one more question, and just sort of drawing on your experience in the mission world. I know you leaders all over the world, and just wanting some of your opinions on this, looking ahead, right? Looking ahead where we are now. What do you believe that the future of missions, and I'm talking about short, medium, long term. I'm talking about all the various expressions of missions that exist, both domestic and international. What do you think that's going to require of the church financially and of business leaders financially? Big question. I know.
That's a hard question. My brain's going to examples where I've seen, huge impact. Think, the finishing the task in Nepal that, our friends Anthony and all those folks were heavily involved with, Miles Phelps. The impact that they're having is unbelievable. And their approach is to train up local pastors, local evangelists, instead of sending all Americans over. And I find that those resources go a lot further when it's done that way. So that'd be one example. There's another one. I was on the board of a missions organization for a little while, and there was a missionary in Thailand who set up a wakeboard park. And so this was a for-profit wakeboard park. And he ran it like a business, but he was there as a missionary, and his opportunity to impact the visitors and the staff was much larger than a lot of folks that show up and, the goal is to plant a church, for example. I'm not saying we shouldn't plant churches. We're called to plant churches. Absolutely. Sure. But the anticipation that the only way to be involved in missions is through church planting or, evangelism conferences, those are fantastic, necessary things, but they're not what everyone's called to. And so I personally have a passion for missions through the marketplace, whether it's here in the States or in developing countries. I love that approach, but that's because of my sense of calling. So I think getting away from, I do believe, and I hope this doesn't sound critical, I do think that we're moving away from large scale, macro, traditional American missions. I oftentimes, especially in complex countries, think, a lot of my time has been spent in the Congo. The complexity of that country for a Westerner to step into and have any sort of, or have at least a consistent impact.
Sure.
It's so much more difficult. And so I think large macro missions organizations might not be the wave of the future. Nothing against that. We give to some large macro missions organizations. But I think that it's moving in a different direction because of I don't think of ROI side of things, but it is nice when you see real fruitfulness. And some of the fruitfulness that I'm seeing, at least where we're involved, is more on a smaller scale, more directly impacting communities in the places that people are called. Yeah.
There's a lot there, there's a lot there. And
it's a big question.
The issue is that we need a multifaceted approach, right, to a complex world. And I know businesses around the world that are making tremendous impact, and I know churches that are making tremendous impact. So it's both and it's one of the things that missions requires is what we like to say around here is we kind of do whatever it takes for this to be done. And so whatever it takes might take a business. It might take a youth ministry center. It might take an English center. It might take all these various expressions.
Yep.
But I think this conversation is unique because many countries around the world are developing economically, leadership-wise, government, civil society. They're on this growth edge, this cusp of growth. And so businesses and marketplace ministries are just a huge piece, I think, that God is moving in to build his church. So,
I think part of the reason, one of my observations with that is that when we're so ingrained in, I'll just use America, when we're so ingrained in American culture and American mindset, it makes it really, really difficult to get a better understanding, have grace for, and engage other cultures. When you're in the marketplace, you're able to kind of cast off those expectations, because I think as believers, a lot of times we're so rooted in American Christian culture, which is not always biblical culture. That's not always the heart of what God's called us to. Oftentimes, I find when we're outside of the four walls, it makes it a little bit easier to come in with less expectation, but rather desire for relationship and introducing people to Jesus instead of the agenda of people fitting into the four walls.
Yeah, that's good. That's the lesson of business, right? I mean, it's customizing, contextualizing, being people first, and not agenda driven. Philip, thank you so much. We're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
Well, thanks for doing it.
I think I've personally been reminded, and I know listeners are reminded, that missions is about participating. Giving to missions is about participating at what God is doing in the future, what he's rolling out, and our response to that. And so I appreciate you modeling that for me and speaking to this audience about that. And for those of you listening, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Edge of the Map podcast. If your heart was stirred, I encourage you to pay attention to that, ask questions, read, talk with us here at Go, and we can connect you. So thank you for joining us, and I'll see you next time. I'm your host, Curtis Elliott, for Edge of the Map podcast.
Thanks for joining us on the Edge of the Map. Every episode is just a small window into what God is doing through missional leaders who are taking the gospel into places most of us will never step foot. And at Go International, we're doing whatever it takes to walk with those leaders and help plant the church where it isn't yet. We want to invite you to be a part of that story. You can join a trip and experience the Edge firsthand. You can help send others through your support. Or you can fuel and fund the mission by supporting our programs, projects, and the people that carry the gospel further. Visit gointernational.org to learn more. Until all have heard, we go.